podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the podcast where if there are bullying allegations against anyone, you resign immediately. You don't wait for the report and then write a column saying you were never bullying anyone. Yes, this is Tennis Unfiltered.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
I'm James Gray of inews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. As always, I've got George Belshaw with me, our resident tennis writer and amateur doubles player, man made of glass, and Calvin Betton, of course, our expert tennis coach. George, you've rushed in from glamorous location, crew via Nantwich, or the other way around.
Yes, I think this is the smartest I've ever been dressed for one of these podcasts before, and possibly the smartest you've ever seen me, James.
No, I have. So I was going to say I've seen you wearing a tie, but actually,
oh yes,
but your inability to tie a tie properly means that actually this jacket and open neck shirt look is smarter.
Smarter. Okay, yeah, that's very true. I'm quite bad at tying ties, or at least I'm bad at doing them properly.
It's like being at a high school prom. Anyway.
Yes, I have been in crew on a very exciting work trip, and mildly, I'm knackered because I have just got in and I went up last night, which was Sunday. And I'm particularly tired because we stayed at this quaint little pub up there, which looked quite nice, really kind of scenic area. And it was right next to this church. And I have no idea why this was happening, but every 15 minutes from 11 p.m. to 2:30, the bells in this church were going off. I don't know what the hell was going on, but it has disrupted my sleep, and I've had a very, very long day of work as well. So you guys are gonna have to perk me up, I'm afraid, but I have confidence you can.
So did I mean, just for reference, I don't know why I'm getting stuck into this, but did the bells stop at 2:30, or did you then get so tired that you could just sleep through them?
Well, I'm unsure. I can't corroborate this, but one of the colleagues I was with says they did stop at 2:30 in the morning, which implies they were up then. But I think I had just got used to it and slept through it. But they weren't going this morning anyway.
Amateur campanology aside, Calvin, how are you?
Yeah, very well, very well. I went to Wembley yesterday to watch the football.
Oh, crikey!
It took me 2.5 hours to get back to the NTC in freezing cold and pissing it down rain.
How much of that was just standing in Wembley Way waiting?
Oh, we walked to Wembley Central, which was about 20 minutes, I think, and then just standing outside the station while they filtered people into the station to get the trains, and then I changed train about 3 or 4 times, and every single one was like a 20-25 minute wait for the next train.
Yeah, I was watching that thinking, because for people who don't know or follow football, Man United beat Brighton on penalties in the FA Cup semi-final yesterday, and Calvin, of course, is a diehard Man United fan. I was watching that thinking, the longer this quite long penalty shootout goes on, the later on a Sunday night it's getting, and the worse the transport. I mean, I pity anyone trying to go back to Brighton on that night, because Southern Rail are bad enough at the best of times.
Yeah. It does amaze me with Wembley that it's supposed to be one of the best stadiums in the world, and it's definitely one of the least accessible.
Yeah, the transport is awful. I mean, yeah, I don't know how they're supposed to make it better, but it's incredibly bottlenecked. Anyway, and you're at the NTC for a training block with Henry?
Yes, we're doing a training week, me, Henry and Jules, and then we will go to Sardinia, unless by some miracle they get in Madrid, but I don't think that's happening. So we'll go to Sardinia, which is a challenger, but it's basically an ATP 500, looking at the entry list. And then back for a week, and then they'll go to another challenger, unless they get in Rome, which is highly unlikely, which will probably also be like an ATP 500, and then French Open.
Very good. And so you'll be in Paris then?
Yeah, I'll be going to Paris. Yeah,
Super. That's super.
It's a strange time of year actually for the doubles players. This because if they don't get in these two Masters, because they're both Madrid is Rome one of these weird 1.5 week ones as well.
No, it's not. It's only a week. But
Right.
You're right. Yeah, I mean Madrid is now one of these. It's actually a 2-week tournament pretty much.
Yeah, so because of that, you can't have another ATP event while there's a Masters series on the same week, and they count both weeks as full weeks. So if you're not getting in the Masters, you don't have a tournament to play in for 3 weeks in a row around this time. And it was only Monte Carlo a week ago, so you don't have a tournament to play in for 3 hours, 4 weeks at the start of the clay season.
It's absolute. I mean, we will talk later about how many clay Masters 1000s there are and why and how it's actually, when you look at the number of withdrawals in Madrid this week, quite the opposite of constructive. But yeah, such are the struggles. Pretty much, if you're not in the top 20, it would seem, but no one appears to care. Right, let's move on. We'll start, as we now always do, with some of your questions. If you want to get in touch with us and submit a question, you can do so on Twitter. We're at unfilteredtennis. You can also drop us an email, tennisunfiltered@gmail.com. I had quite a few emails over the last couple of weeks and haven't always got to them, so I apologise if you have sent an email and I haven't read it out or maybe replied to you, as I sometimes do. And incidentally, the most certain way to make sure that I read out whatever you said is to leave us a 5-star review, because I read out all of those. So that is the best way to get your question onto the podcast, but I do try and check our Twitter and our email as regularly as possible as well. Let's start with... Well, let's start with a very clay-specific question. Hello from Santa Fe, New Mexico, writes Carmen on email. She says, with the clay season in full swing, I'd like to learn more about how chair umpires determine which specific mark on the court was made by the ball when a player challenges a call. The umpire seems very confident about which mark it was, but how can that be if there are so many smudges on the clay court? At times it seems quite arbitrary. Also, why isn't Hawkeye the default choice? Seems like a more reliable, fast and fair way to call a ball in or out. Thank you for your wonderful podcast. It makes my walk to work so much more pleasant and entertaining. You're welcome, Carmen, and I'm sure your walk to work is much more pleasant than mine, on which I got absolutely soaked this morning because you're in New Mexico. Well, I can answer the sort of Hawkeye question, which is, as I understand it, basically Hawkeye gets disrupted by the clay, right? And they haven't really figured out a way to deal with the surface. I can't be more technical than that, and someone may know more than me. George, you're looking pensive about that one.
I think it's just got a higher margin of error than it does on other surfaces because of that. So it's kind of less accurate by a certain number of millimeters or centimeters that Calvin can probably go even further as we slightly get closer to the truth.
I think it's that, and also I think it's something to do because they have raised lines on a lot of courts. So this is always a weird one with clay, with the marks as well, though, that is it in or out? Because if the line was if a ball's dropping, it's hard to explain this without visuals, but if a ball is dropping and it clips the outside of the line on a clay court and it cleans, like, say, the last 2 millimeters, you could argue that if the line wasn't raised, then that ball would have actually gone out. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I know exactly.
So there's a constant debate is what is the dimensions of a clay tennis court, because they slightly change by about 1 millimeter with raised lines. Now, a lot of clay courts now don't have raised lines. They build the lines into the clay, but some places do.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which tournament it was last year, but essentially one of the lines was raised and the fixing had come a little bit loose, so it was a little bit more raised. You know, like when you've got a rug and it rolls up and players were tripping over it. It was incredibly dangerous. So you can see why they're building it into the court. I mean, on the marks thing, incidentally, there is a system called Fox 10, isn't it? Which I think they have used in some. I've seen it used in clay court tournaments, and it is essentially, whereas Hawkeye is a simulation, Fox 10 is a hypermotion camera trained on the line, and when you get the review, you can see that you literally just get a very, very hypermotion, slow motion video of the ball bouncing on the line, the line or whatever. So I know they do use that. Why they haven't instituted it, I don't know. It's kind of that tennis doesn't like changing things quickly. I mean, I know why they haven't done it at Wimbledon. I suspect there is a similar thing in the French Open. One of the big push factors at Wimbledon is that Polo Ralph Lauren pay a lot of money for that advertising deal, and all of the chair umpires are very, very cleverly and very softly advertising Polo Ralph Lauren in their quite striking outfits. And I suspect the French Open have something quite similar, George.
Yeah, there probably is some of that. I do kind of quite like the charm of the umpire coming down from the chair a little bit more in clay matches as well. It's not something you get on the other surfaces. Normally they kind of stick around up there, and I don't know. It adds a slightly different dimension as a traditionalist.
I just have no confidence. Like I'm kind of with you, George. And look, this is the entertainment business, but I have no confidence. Like probably 50% of the time, I reckon the umpire points to the right mark. Like because the umpire can't possibly know when the ball lands that it's going to get called out. Their eyes have probably already started to shift to the other side of the net when the out call comes, and then they've got to go and find the mark again. I can't understand it.
Yeah, I'm always amazed that there aren't more arguments about if they've circled the right line. Now it's early on in the set, it's fine. There aren't many lines, there aren't many marks there. But towards the end of a set, you've got foot marks and ball marks and everything. And I remember this was years ago, like maybe 10 years ago. I was a girl player who I used to coach who was very good. She played in her first Tennis Europe final, which for anyone that doesn't know is basically the highest level of under 14s tennis. And she played a girl who was around about the same level, but much more experienced. She played a lot more Tennis Europes and a lot more on clay. And they had an umpire in that match. And I was watching from the side of it. And the girl who had a lot more experience just constantly kept circling the wrong mark. And I was watching the match from the side, and I was doing my nutting because the girl who I coached she just accepted it. And the umpire really, it was amazing to me that the umpire just never said, no, that's not the mark, that all of these marks were out. And it must have happened 9 or 10 times in the match. And the umpire just kept going and looking at the wrong mark and then just going, yeah, that's out, and pointing a finger. And it amazes me in matches. You do see it occasionally where the players will go, that's just not the mark. But it seems a very imperfect way of doing it. But yeah, is what it is.
I can't remember if it was this week or last week, but Djokovic had a bit of a row. I think it might have been Monte Carlo actually, but it was the conversation around that was quite interesting, and one that is a problem with this system was that the umpire basically came down and said, I'm not sure this is the mark, but this is the one I think it is. Djokovic was like, that is categorically not the mark. And then the umpire turns to kind of the line judge, who's also meant to be checking the mark. He's like, I don't know. And the umpire just sticks with the original kind of call. And then they showed the replay, and it was like, no, Djokovic was definitely right on that. But that just felt quite weird, like sticking with something that you're so unsure about. You're having to kind of check with the line judge and then not having that further fallback of like some technology, even though everyone on TV can see that it's kind of clearly out. It just feels quite a weird system.
It's one of those situations where you would say, well, we should have video review. But then if you were going to accept that you should have video review, you would then just say, well, let's have Fox 10 or some kind of, electronic line calling review system.
Yeah, I think maybe there's a glorious hybrid where you can keep the tradition of them coming down, but have like 3 challenges a match beyond them or something.
Yeah.
So, if you're really unsure, you can just press a button and then have fun with it.
I mean,
what I always find most interesting is how many of these the umpire seems to come down in a clay match way more than challenges get made in. So you'd think like, what are they? Is it just that the line judges are making these terrible calls all the time, or are the players just trying it on more, or what?
I guess that the umpire isn't limited in how many times they can come down, whereas when you've got challenges at Wimbledon, you are limited in how many you've got. So,
yeah, I reckon they just like want to stretch their legs as well. Like, even if the player's not interested, it's just like, well, I'm going to get off this really uncomfortable wooden chair and just like have a little jog around the court for 5 minutes.
I do also, I know there's lots of regulations about umpires doing this, but I always think it's bad when the player's having a fight and the umpire's like leaning down off the chair. There's something about it which I think is very schoolmasterly and a bit weird. Sorry, Calvin.
I think, in fairness to the players as well, it does help the other way that we get a lot more challenges saved and the game does move a bit quicker, because if they see, say, player serves an ace and it gets called out and the returning player can see it's cleaned the line, they'll just go and give it rather than make them challenge it and we have to wait for the challenge. They'll know it straight away and they'll just go and do that, which they wouldn't be able to do if it didn't leave a mark.
Yeah, it'd be good to see someone weird must have done this somewhere, but good to see the kind of time a match is kind of held up by clay court challenges versus actual challenges elsewhere. I suspect the clay ones might be quicker, even though they feel like they might be more frequent and the umpires having a little jog.
I'm sure the Hawkeye is slower. I'm absolutely sure it's slower because, like, also umpires are very good at just like getting straight down. Like there's a kind of acknowledgement. Like they're quite good at slipping off the chair. Like it's almost like there's a slide.
Yeah, they're on it.
Yeah. Incidentally, the Djokovic incident you're talking about, George, was during the Mazzetti match in Monte Carlo, and he was arguing with umpire Aurélie Tourt. I almost asked you, was the umpire in question female? Because I have a theory that there's a bit of a pattern with certain players and female umpires that they get questioned a bit more than some male umpires. Don't get me wrong, some players just don't get on with umpires, Carlos Bernardes, for example. But I'm not saying all players don't get on with Carlos Bernardes. I'm saying Rafa Nadal previously has had a very big problem with Carlos Bernardes. Although I actually heard an interesting story the other day that he's basically completely buried the hatchet with him, and they've kind of put it all past them, and he's actually done some quite nice things personally for Bernardes that have kind of helped smooth things over. So just one of those interesting little things. But there you go. Yeah, I've always found the marks quite remarkable, if you'll pardon the pun. So there you go, Carmen. I hope that answers your question in one way or another. Let's go to Kenny Koala Bear on Twitter. He says, what can be done to address the distinct prize money differences in WTA and ATP tournaments? The difference between Stuttgart and Barcelona was huge. I saw this as well. I saw David Law and Danny Valverde. I was going to say conversing about it. I mean, they were basically arguing on Twitter about this. David Law pointing out, yes, the huge... Carlos Alcaraz won Barcelona and won €477,000. Iga Swiatek won Stuttgart and won €104,000. To quote David, and some people will have heard him talk about this on their own podcast, the sooner we really do see #Tennis United, the better. Calvin?
Look, like it or not, and David Law's just talking nonsense there, because the reason there's a discrepancy is because they're not run by the same people. They're run by two completely different organisations. The tournaments aren't involved with each other whatsoever. They're two completely different tournaments that are run by two completely different organisations. In all but actual theory that they're playing the same sport, they could be two completely different sports. They're not those two tournaments are not connected, just as men's tournaments are not connected. Some men's tournaments have way more money than other men's tournaments. I think we spoke on the pod a few weeks ago how Doha had double the prize money of Marseille, and they were both in theory the same level of tournament. They're either 250s or 500s. The tournaments can give as much prize money as they choose to. That's entirely up to the tournaments. And if they don't I can see an argument if the tournament is running men's and women's and they choose to not pay the women less. That's not on, and I think, is it Rome that does that?
Yeah, Rome runs a parallel tournament and they're not equal, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but that's not on. But you can't say it's a disgrace that this men's tournament pays this much and this women's tournament pays this much. The reason why the women's tournament doesn't pay as much is I imagine they're not pulling as much money in revenues and sponsorship and that kind of thing, and they can't justify paying the same amount of money. But to make out that it's some sort of that some governing body can deal with it. Who? What governing body? And the Tennis United thing, it's just not going to happen. Or I don't see why it would happen, if I'm honest. I don't see why the men would agree to it. And I'm not saying I agree that but that would mean them losing out on money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the whole thing that the PTPA kind of thing talks about, but also shies away from, is the fact that, yes, exactly, like, the women's game does not generate as much revenue. Now, tennis is great because it pays equal prize money at Grand Slams and at some other events. And I don't think there is a single sport in the world where that's the case. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no one who has that kind of top-level prize money parity. And I know there are lots of male players who think that's a total nonsense and that they shouldn't be getting that cash. But yeah, your point is valid. I think David's point, and he kind of clarified it in another tweet, which I've got in front of me, It says the biggest, best, and most lucrative for men as well tournaments are the Grand Slams, followed by combined 1,000 events, men and women working together to raise the tide for all and achieving equality. You'd think that would be a sensible and obvious goal. George, feel free to come in on this, but I do sort of largely agree with him. But the practical, David knows this. He's worked at the ATP. Like the practicality is that it's never going to happen. So what do we actually do?
Well, I mean, the other thing to say is, the other reason they're the most lucrative events, broadly speaking, is because they're the biggest events and they're the most popular, and they're in big cities. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but the actual broader structural problem is that a lot of the tournaments that aren't at that level aren't played at big enough sites to possibly host everyone at the same time. That's the other fundamental challenge with all of this is, I think there's a few different points that could come in this. The one that sounds most appealing probably to most people think aiming for an egalitarian society, which, I'm broadly in that park.
Sorry, you're broadly in favour of gender equality. I'd love to know
not gender equality. I said egalitarian. That's broader than gender. Okay. I said broadly in that park, James, without going, too weird. I'm definitely in favour of gender equality, just to clarify. I feel like I better nail that point there.
I thought I might be able to get you cancelled there.
That wouldn't have been so good. I think broadly the best way you would go about doing it would be to set rungs of prize money and the same prize money for every rung. So at the Grand Slams, you earn this amount of money. So you'd have no difference between Wimbledon and the Australian Open. It would be consistent across the board. Same at Masters level, same at 500, same at 250. That's the best way to do it. But Calvin's right. That wouldn't be that appealing to the players because there is a wide discrepancy between what the tournaments at each of these levels are paying, lesser at the Grand Slams because they're all paying a massive chunk, but there is still a bit of one-upmanship going on there to kind of be the most popular Grand Slam with the players. But at the thousands level, there is quite a big discrepancy. So picking that point within that range, it would never be the top one because they couldn't all make that money. So you'd have to pull it down potentially to the middle of the bottom one. And actually, that probably would mean that the male players certainly would be getting paid less money. And that would particularly be the case at the 500 and 250s. And the 250s that are running in current form definitely would have to be paying towards the bottom because the reason they're paying close to the bottom right now is they're not that viable events because they're smaller tournaments and they don't attract the big names. And the money they do spend is quite often on appearance fees for the biggest players, which then soaks up the majority of the money they might give to the rest of the field. So you'd have to get buy-in from the biggest players to almost hand that sort of money back and then still have a problem with a lot of these tournaments. So economically, it's quite a difficult challenge to bring that parity in, even though I do support it. So I think that's the best way, the fairest way, but it's practically not going to happen with so many different people, so many fingers in so many different pies, I don't think.
One of the reasons I know it's not going to happen is because the players at the top just won't agree to it. You got to remember not just men's and women's. The top players in the men's are currently basically under the table campaigning to get doubles players paid less money. Now the prize money at tournaments is split broadly at about, they say 80-20. 80% of the prize money goes to singles players, 20 to doubles. It's more 80-10-10 because that 20 is split between the two doubles, between the pair of doubles players. When they come in. And they're currently, in inverted commas, looking at the data to seeing if doubles justifies that. Now, all they're going to find there, so they're looking at the data to see if enough people are interested in doubles for a product that they've made no attempt to market or improve whatsoever. So, and we all know what it's for. We saw Riley Opelka coming with another one of his idiotic rants the other week about, why are they getting the money? We should get all the money. And the next step, I can guarantee you, because it's the next logical step, is they'll start trying to get less money for earlier round in the slams. And this is what I've always said. I've never wavered on this. The PTPA is Novak Djokovic trying to get more of the money pumped into the latter stages of the big tournaments. He doesn't think that getting £3 million for winning a tournament is enough.
Well, that's a can of worms.
That's 2 weeks in a row the crocodiles have been swarming out the swamp, I think, from Calvin, heading towards Barnsley.
God knows why Vasek Pospisil wants to do that, though, because I know which one of those categories he's falling in.
Well, yeah, quite. I was going to make a point that again, and this is something that I actually slightly agree with when it comes to PTPA, although it would have a lot of problems, is they've always said they want more transparency from tournaments about how much money they really are making, because they think that tournaments are screwing them, basically. They want to know what percentage of revenue that tournaments make goes into their pockets, because they think it's vanishingly small. Now, I think it's very short-sighted, and I think probably if I was running a Saudi Arabian investment fund, I would be thinking that it's pretty bloody easy to walk into that room and say, here's a very large check and we'll give you 50% of the revenue we generate from tournaments. But that's again an even bigger can of worms, you might argue. But I just think there's so many problems that come with that kind of transparency, but I do understand why they would argue for it.
Yeah, just one final point, kind of on the model I was kind of putting forward. What I've also essentially proposed is a salary cap for everyone.
Yeah.
And that really would not go down well with a group of players who are convinced that they're not being paid anywhere closely enough. And look, I don't want to go in the ins and outs of whether they're right or not, but I think they have delusions of grandeur of how watched and popular tennis is right now. But who knows? It's a tough one to kind of unpick.
My question is, who are the people getting really rich? Like, if the players think they're not getting paid enough, right? Like, they think... Because what we often talk about on this podcast, and this is broadening things out a lot, but why not? Is that we think that the pie is misdivided and that it's, it needs to be divided a bit more towards the back end so that there's a sustainable ecosystem. What the players think is that the pie isn't big enough. And so because they think that it's a small piece of a much larger pie. But what I want to know is who's getting the rest of the pie? Like, who are these people that are making millions of pounds out of tennis that the players
Roger
want?
Federer.
But
It's individual rights deals. If those were tied into the sport, that would make a huge difference to how marketable tennis is.
Individual image rights?
Yeah, that sort of thing. Definitely.
Which is something the PTPA are really pushing.
I mean, the joining up of that. I'm shocked Djokovic would actually want to go for that.
They're not pushing that. They're pushing they're pushing ways to make players' image rights more valuable. Basically, it's one of the things they've talked about.
Well, they'll be more valuable if they're more marketable and better at tennis. And the ones who are good like that do make a shitload of money. But the reality is, if they want to bring the sport along with them, bring those lot back into the pie, and good luck getting that to happen.
I mean, you can make an argument like Wimbledon makes a fortune from the tournament.
Yeah.
And that may be what they're, that may be what they're saying. But then, Wimbledon also puts on a hell of a tournament for them. And other things as well. There's things like at the tournaments, like at Wimbledon, for example, they pay a per diem for accommodation for each player, which is about £300 a day. And that doesn't get included in prize money. Now, work that out, how much money is going into that, and it's a fair whack across everything, across men's, wheelchair, juniors, women's, doubles, mixed doubles, and that kind of thing. You're looking at, and that's just one of the things, like where the money goes. They put on that club to hold the tournament at that club, which is a huge piece of real estate just out of central London. It needs paying for, doesn't it? So.
I assume players probably look at the 40-odd million quid that Wimbledon give the LTA every year and go, well, we should have some of that. And there's arguments about where that money should go and what should be done with it. But yes, I think you're right, Calvin. There probably is a lot of money going in their pockets that they don't even really consider. I mean, look, I'm broadly in favour of workers' rights and representation is important, but I think we all agree that they have misplaced gripes.
I'm very much in that camp, James. But also, you can turn up at Wimbledon and lose and not win a single game and collect about 70 grand. So plus your 300 quid a day accommodation from the Saturday before the tournament starts. So it's not like anywhere in those tournaments they're being underpaid, and that's that goes for all of the slams. And also the 250s and the 300s. That tennis players who are playing on the main tour are very handsomely paid at every level.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who would argue that it's not so much they're being paid for that round one, but actually that's almost like their salary for their ranking to qualify the tournament.
Yeah, sure.
Really, in some ways, which is a kind of, I think that's a kind of nicer way of.
No, sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, I agree. They're not doing badly when you get to that kind of level of the rankings.
Well, on that then, they're on a base salary of about 280 grand a year, I think. 240 grand a year.
Yeah.
80. Plus very good bonuses.
Yeah.
So, and if you know about Djokovic, you're on a salary of about 5 million plus bonuses.
Yeah. Well, next week we'll pull out some prize money numbers and maybe try and drill down a little bit deeper into exactly who makes how much money on the tour. But we're going to move on for now because Matt has sent me an email. Not this second. It was a while ago. He actually sent me 2 emails, but the first one was blank. He says, watching Alcaraz drop shot Tsitsipas over a dozen times, it struck me that drop shots seem to be a more important tactic than they used to be. I'm only 29, so don't have that much to compare to, though. What do you think? Are drop shots used more now than they used to be? Also, how much can you coach when to play a drop shot, and how much of that is down to instinct? Down to our tennis correspondent from the past, Calvin. Do they use drop shots more now than they used to?
No, I don't think so necessarily. I'd say probably slightly less, if I'm honest. I mean, it's changed with Alcaraz because he loves a drop shot, but I don't think like Djokovic has never been a big drop shotter.
Well, I was going to say, I was actually going to kind of go the other way around. I think Djokovic has used it a lot more in the latter stages of his career. Sometimes excessively weirdly, but it felt like years back in his career it was very kind of baseline. But since maybe I'm really picking a random date here, but sometime beyond kind of 2016, I think he has become very drop shot centric. So I was kind of going to say I think it went out of fashion and might have come back in, but yeah, I mean Alcaraz is really noticeable just because he's got a bloody brilliant one. I mean, it is a really, really good drop shot. It's much better than Djokovic's, who loves to use it but is actually quite bad at it.
I'm sorry, James.
Was it any harder to play with older rackets? Is it easier to play with modern technology?
I mean, I'm not that old, James. I mean, the thing is, racket technology hasn't really moved on in the last 20 years. It kind of reached what it was, and there might have been like the odd 1 or 2%. But if you look at a tennis racket from 20 years ago now, like the head radical from 20 years ago, it's basically the same as what it is now. What it is now. Whereas if you looked at a racket from 20 years before that, it's light years away. Well, it still would from 20 years before that. So no, I wouldn't think that would have any effect. I mean, what I will say is, well, you see a lot more drop shots on clay for various reasons. That the ball digs into the clay more, players stand further back on clay. You need to find other ways to win points. And what you'll also find is the players who tend to be better at hitting drop shots tend to have played a lot on clay in their youth for that reason. They have to find ways. In answer to can you coach it? Yeah, absolutely. I actually wrote, when I did my level 5 coaching qualification, we had to do a special project, which is basically a thesis, and I did it specifically on coaching how to coach a drop shot. So
in short and in layman's terms, what's the start point for teaching someone how to play a good drop shot?
Well, there's 2 elements of it. There's the decision making and the technique of hitting it. But what my thesis was about was basically combining the 2 of them, and how do you go about the process of seeing the opportunity and the 4 stages of any shot, which is anticipation, perception, decision, and action, actually hitting the shot. And it's basically around the tactical decision to hit it. When would you do it? What do you have to be seeing at the other side of the net? What ball do you have to be receiving? And then how you go about hitting it and the stages of doing that. So when I think, was it Matt, he asked the question, he said, what or is it just instinct? Well, can you coach it, or is it just instinct? It's both. You coach it to become instinct. That's what you want. So the player just does it. They know when they're going to play it. When this happens, this is when I'm going to do a drop shot.
And I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Calvin, but I'm imagining, looking at Carlos Alcaraz, for example, he's always had an enormous forehand, like from a very early age, and he's also grown up mostly playing on clay. So I imagine he would have experienced a lot of opponents getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And, maybe he's hit 4 or 5 in a row and then hit an error. So he's like, well, is there a way I can deal with this, by not having to hit 5 forehands? And then you develop the drop shot. Is that about the kind of size of it?
Yeah, and you often find that players who have huge forehands also have good drop shots. So Federer had a good drop shot. Jim Courier was one of the big proponents of hitting drop shots on clay courts, and he had a huge forehand. Don't remember Del Potro hitting too many, but then he could just hit through. He didn't, he could stand, you could stand 7 miles behind the baseline, and Del Potro still hit through you. So, so it's that kind of thing, and I hope that answers it.
There's 2 other trends that I'd be kind of interested to see if they'd made a difference. And I'm sort of prompting Calvin here to see if he has any thoughts on the answers. But one of them is the pace of the players. Like, are players now just broadly quicker, meaning it's a harder shot to play than they were 20 years ago? Has that moved on sufficiently, or are they much fitter, as technology's going on? The second one is you, and I'm going to use you because you are always hammering this home to us. You always say that, stuff like the grass courts have become a lot more similar to hard courts. So when the courts had more variety, was it a better shot to use versus now where they're all the same? Or has it made it easier because the courts are becoming more similar, so they actually know how to do it better on all different surfaces?
The clay courts are basically the same. I don't think the clay courts are any slower or faster than they used to be. They've still got there is still actually quite a lot of variation in the pace of clay courts. And that always surprises me every year. I've seen it just in watching the players I coached this year that I've seen one of the slowest courts I've ever seen in Italy a few weeks ago. And then we'll see at Madrid next week. The court's basically medium to fast pace. French Open's actually pretty quick, apart from that year when it was played in the middle of winter, where it was massively slow. But the French is pretty quick. Monte Carlo's pretty quick. So I'm not sure that we are seeing less drop shots, to be honest. Well, like obviously Alcaraz is playing a cartload of them. And in terms of is it because the players are quicker? I'd counter that by saying players are standing further back. We're getting more and more players who are returning from 12 feet behind the baseline at the top of the game.
Yeah, it's crazy that. It seems. It's one of those. I know that tactics and fashion in sport always go in cycles, and invariably nothing is ever that new. But you would think that massively deep return position thing would have prompted lots of drop shots to kind of work back against it. But I suppose, again, this might come back to what kind of ball you can drop shot off, Calvin. If someone's standing massively back, they've got more of a chance of getting a good hit on it, and they probably hit it with a lot more spin, so that makes it harder to drop, I guess.
That, and you'll also, part of the drop shot, which I wrote about, was that you plan it 1 or 2 shots in advance as well sometimes. Or you're waiting for it, right? When this happens, this is when I'm going to hit it. If they're in this position, if I can hit this shot, that's when I'm going to follow it up with a drop shot. So, what I am amazed at is that we still don't see, when against those type of players, we don't see as many underarm serves.
Yeah.
Because you'd think that would just stop that dead in its tracks.
Yes, but then there's the omerta on underarm serves, because it's such a bad thing to do. Right, I've got one more question that I've pulled out of the mailbag, which we'll do before the break. It's from Ian Warren, a regular correspondent in Melbourne, who I always like getting questions from. On Twitter, remember we're at Unfiltered Tennis on Twitter. He says, is the WTA trying to win a prize for the most incompetent sporting body? First, the China saga, followed by top 10 players not allowed to enter 250 events, and the schedule of tournaments. Last week, a 28-player draw in one tournament, while the men had 3 tournaments. I don't like to slag off the WTA too much, but I think if there is a prize for most incompetent sporting body, that's sewn up for a while. I don't know. George, you love a schedule.
Yeah. Is it the most incompetent? I'm trying to think of
that's not the real question, George.
I'm not sure if it's the most incompetent one in tennis, to be honest. And I'm not even going beyond other sports yet. Look, it's not great, is it? And I think I saw they were out in Bogota this week, and that just feels really random, kind of joint scheduling alongside kind of Stuttgart. I don't know. Yeah, none of them are kind of really. I'm getting too bogged down with the incompetent question in this rather than the actual kind of issues. You are. I'm finding it harder to move away from that. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of. I do think, as we kind of touched on earlier with the money in the games, I think that running the WTA Tour is a lot harder than running the ATP Tour. In many ways, because of those kind of revenue challenges. So I am also a little bit wary of just like dumping on them when, you know, market forces, and let's be honest, probably quite sexist market forces, are kind of strongly in the ATP's favour. So I think the WTA, to a degree, do have to do a bit more what Harry Redknapp might call wheeler dealing.
I'm not a wheeler dealer, all right?
And come up with a few stranger results. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously like on the China point specifically, you know, it's quite disappointing. They've kind of reversed that moral stance, but then, you know, broader tennis has reverted moral stances on things like gambling that they know is a huge issue, and they all move to kind of stop selling data to, you know, that is virtually serving gambling addicts and nothing else, and promoting match fixing. They all stopped doing that for a couple of years and then decided, oh crap, we all want the money again. So it's nothing new. I'm not saying that makes it right or wrong. But the reality for the WTA is, as we said at the time with the China thing, you know, when they were taking that stance, they were putting their own tour entirely at financial risk. And the fact that hasn't then become kind of embedded in the ATP as part of what David Law calls United Tennis or Tennis United is probably not necessarily great for the game either, in the sense that, you know, it is quite a weak product that's going to, well, I say weak, it's not a weak product, but it is more vulnerable to take deals that aren't necessarily the best ones to take from a kind of sporting perspective, but giving them quite heavily financial incentives to take that to then provide a better product at other stages in the year. So, yeah, I wouldn't say they're the most incompetent. I think they have a lot of embedded challenges as well. That's a very long-winded answer.
The most challenged sporting body, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, it's not the easiest gig, to be fair.
No, and I think we do hold them to a really high standard because, like, we sort of expect the ATP and the WTA to be as good as each other. And as you've mentioned and alluded to, and as we know, the reality is that financially they're not on a level playing field. That's for a whole number of reasons, which is several podcasts worth of discussion. But yes, maybe we do judge them a bit too harshly. Nevertheless, Calvin, you've already had one moan about scheduling. I mean, it does seem a bit incongruous that there's only one WTA level tournament in Europe last week, and there were only 28 players in the draw. But I imagine Porsche play quite a lot of money for that.
Yeah, I imagine so. The problem, I think, the main problem the WTA has is that the places that want to give them the most money and the places where women's tennis is exceptionally popular are probably run by the worst people in the world. In terms of China and Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi and Qatar. If they could basically have their whole tour there and make an absolute fortune from it.
Yeah.
But there are reasons why they can't do that. And one specific, we know why they can't go to China, why they haven't gone to China for a while. Although there is a school of thought, I don't know enough about it to have an opinion of it, but I'm told by a few people who know more about it than I do that the only reason they felt they could step away from China was because they'd just signed a huge sponsorship deal a couple of weeks before that. And now that money is running out. And if it wasn't for that sponsorship deal, they'd had a real tricky question to ask about whether they ever pulled out of China at all.
Well, it's certainly true that the Hologic deal came in at a quite similar time to that decision being made, and I've no doubt that it was a difficult financial decision to make, and if you've got some cash in your pocket, that does make it easier. I would also say, and I think I said this at the time, that the WTA haven't boycotted any tournaments in China. There would not have been any tournaments in China during the time they boycotted. Now, we praised the decision to do it at the time, and we should say that again, but that doesn't mean that we should then say, well done for at least doing it for a bit, because the reality is they didn't actually suffer because of it. They knew that they would have suffered, but there haven't been any major sporting events in China, barring the Winter Olympics, which I went to and was one of the very few people in the world who went to it who wasn't an athlete, because it was a closed games. Barring that, basically nothing has happened. The odd badminton tournament, I believe, lots of internal tournaments, but in terms of international sporting events, the ATP are only just going back there later this year. George?
Yeah, I was just going to make one kind of other point, not on China, but just to kind of give people a bit of a sense of the kind of the bigger challenges on some of the WTA tournaments. So in Britain, while Queen's is quite a profitable ATP event, the women's equivalent for years was Birmingham, which they've now downgraded in terms of level. But that event was running at a huge loss for years, and that was for me a good. Again, speaking from my egalitarian hat of wanting things to be closer to equal, the LTA let that run at a loss for a year because they thought it was the right decision, and that I think they were right in some degrees to try and attract the best women's players from the world, even if it wasn't costing them money, because it's kind of encouraging the next generation of people to have the chance to see, of women to have the chance to see top level female athletes getting paid really well for something good. That's an inspiring good thing that countries like ours should do, Grand Slam nations who do have the money to invest in a game like that. So, they've kind of now let that slip, and it's been overtaken by, is it Berlin? I think that's the same week. That's now kind of got the mandatory top 10 players to go. And Birmingham, has kind of gone down. But it's just worth kind of just stressing that point again from a financial and economic perspective. That's basically the same tournament, Queen's and Birmingham. Okay, one's in London, one's in Birmingham. But they were very, very, very different costings, despite arguably getting better fields in Birmingham some years. So, that is some of the challenges that come with putting these events on, which shouldn't be so challenging for a Grand Slam nation. But when you take that out to the rest of the world, it ain't quite as appealing, to be honest, at times.
Some grim realities there, George. Well, after the break, we'll talk about some actual tennis, including Iga Swiatek, Carlos Alcaraz, and Dusan Lajovic.
Well, listeners, in case you didn't get enough sports today, here's an ad break that'll tell you how to watch even more sports. YouTube is the new home of NFL Sunday Ticket. And if you sign up now, you'll get our lowest full season price of the year. Just go to youtube.com/Spotify offer to get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket. Watch your favorite teams' out-of-market Sunday afternoon games, exclusively on YouTube and YouTube TV. All right, enough about sports. Go get more sports. Terms and embargoes apply. Offer ends June 6th. No refunds.
Welcome back to Tennis Unfiltered with me, James Gray of iNewspaper and iNews.co.uk. I've got tennis writer George Belshaw and our resident tennis coach Calvin Betton with me as always. Right now, moving on to Stuttgart, which we've already mentioned a couple of times tonight, and its meagre prize money and its solitary place in the WTA calendar, such that it is. Iga Swiatek defended the title successfully. She beat Aryna Sabalenka in the final to prove that she has come back from injury without too many ill effects. George, Iga Swiatek, Roland Garros favourite already.
Yeah, I've been fairly confident she'll win it. If I was going to bring out my famous percentages, I'd probably look in.
George, please.
She would be closer to probably the 50% mark, I would say. I think she's the overwhelming favourite in terms of her quality on this surface and just broadly her quality. And I think the clay diminishes Sabalenka and Rybakina probably fancy Sabalenka to do better, weirdly. I'm not sure that's based on anything, just broader kind of torn nous over the years than Rybakina. But, those two will be hoping to do well. And, they had fantastic starts to the year. But it was fairly routine, I would say, for Swiatek. And I think she's capable of winning the French Open in fairly routine manner. There's not many players out there I'd be thinking, really don't fancy Swiatek today. When she first kind of came through, you still had kind of Halep kicking around at the top, who kind of felt like, that's someone who's really good on clay, who is a multiple Grand Slam champion who can go and do it. The rest of the Grand Slam champions at the moment, I don't feel any of them are like really super clay proficient. Probably Krejcikova is the other one who feels most likely to do damage. And
also Krejcikova's got a bit of the wood over Swiatek. She's beaten her a couple of times and seems to be someone. I mean, I was just looking. She's something like 41-3. Since the pandemic, I think, on clay. And the three people who've beaten her are Ash Barty, Maria Sakkari, and then Caroline Garcia. Now, Garcia aside, I think what's interesting there is they are not power players. I know Sakkari is powerful, but we don't consider her a power player. She's more of a nous player, I think. And I tend to think, and certainly this year, Swiatek has looked vulnerable when someone's come on the court and taken the racket out of her hand. And she's not, when Rybakina beat her in Indian Wells, for example, and also the Australian Open, of course, she's not looked like she's had the kind of weaponry to come back at them. I think her defence is much improved, but she's still, as you mentioned, George, when you get on the clay, it sort of neutralises those bigger hitters a little bit, and I think that really told. And also, she dropped a set to Karolina Pliskova, which kind of tells you a little bit about what you need to know. And okay, a bit of ring rust there. It was only her third set since Indian Wells, so that's 6 weeks off, so I think we can probably say that as well. But I think beating Aryna Sabalenka is quite a big statement given her form this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say the other player who has actually been very good on clay the last few years, and someone who could do well there is Coco Gauff, but of course she has such a poor record against Swiatek that she doesn't even feel like she comes in the picture for me. Like, as long as Swiatek's in that tournament, I wouldn't give Gauff a chance. Whereas if the rest of the field started falling and Swiatek, for whatever reason, wasn't in the mix, Gauff definitely feels closer to winning the French Open to me than she has done other slams. But
I mean, there's always a chance to find a bit of form, of course, albeit with the WTA calendar, there's precious little chance to find form on clay. But she's also kind of lacking and had some pretty poor results since the Australian Open. She got gubbed by Sabalenka. All right, a very good Sabalenka, but she got gubbed by Sabalenka in Indian Wells. She lost that horrible matchup that she has to Swiatek in Dubai. She's then lost twice to Anastasia Potapova, in which I don't really know how to process that. I didn't see either match, so I can't really comment on it too much. But on paper, and she only won 5 games in Stuttgart. On paper, look, she'll go to Madrid, and Madrid compared to Stuttgart is pretty different. Albeit Stuttgart is quick for clay, but it's indoors, and I think it's a bit skiddier, and Madrid is different. But I think the one we would have been talking about is Ons Jabeur. But she, pulled out after 3 games against Swiatek. She's just announced that she's pulled out of Madrid because she's got a small tear in her calf. I'll need more time to recover. I'm sad to announce I won't be able to compete and defend my title at Madrid this year. I'd like to wish everyone in the tournament a great event and looking forward to coming back next year. I mean, Calvin, you're a man who's had his fair share of calf struggles. They can be a bit funny, can't they? It takes time to come back.
Yeah, they can, and it's not something that you can play through either, because it's so much of tennis. I mean, your whole sprinting comes from the calf. So, yeah, you can't really play if you've got a calf injury, unless it's a very, very mild one. So, yeah, that could be a major problem, I think. The
other result from the Stuttgart tournament, which and correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't talk about this last week, right? Which is Emma Raducanu. Is that right? I'm thinking that must have happened just after the podcast last week. Good. I'm glad I wasn't misremembering things. She obviously needed a wild card to get into the Porsche Grand Prix. She was given a wild card partly on basis of her 2.5 million Instagram followers, partly on the basis that she is sponsored by Porsche. She skipped the Billie Jean King Cup to play there because of the changing in surface from outdoor hard to indoor hard and then to clay would have been a bit much, and she is load managing at the moment. She was beaten in 59 minutes by Jelena Ostapenko, 6-2, 6-1. It was pretty chastening, I think, George, for Raducanu. I mean, it's a terrible result on paper. Okay, Ostapenko can be a good player on her day, but it's not what you want to see, is it?
I mean, Ostapenko is a funny one, to be fair. I mean, she when she is hitting that ball well, she is pretty bloody hard to stop. And yeah, but it's not a pretty scoreline. I mean, I saw some very odd comments this week about Raducanu just getting dreadful luck with draws at the minute, which I found a bit bemusing. I mean, she got a qualifier first round this week, and then she has to play Swiatek second round, but she's also world number 70. You know, getting a qualifier in the first round is a bloody good draw for what is she world number 70? She's probably further out than that now. But
74, I think, but yeah.
But, you know, Indian Wells, I don't think you can say Kovanic going into Magdala Net's a bad draw. Miami, okay, Andreescu, but that is an unseeded player at the time. Ostapenko's unseeded. You know, you don't know what you're going to get with Ostapenko, similar with Andreescu. They're not perfect draws, but I don't think you can sit there and say, God, all of these are unwinnable matches for a player who's won a Grand Slam before.
I think this is the really tough thing, and you know, Calvin, you may disagree, but I think, you know, Raducanu can get into any tournament she wants, essentially. Probably for another year or two, she could probably not win another match and would still pick up wildcards, at any tournament that she felt like playing. And that's not a slight on her, that's just the truth. Is there an argument that, and if she doesn't beat Iga Swiatek in the second round in Madrid, there is a good chance she will fall outside the top 100. Is there an argument, actually, Calvin, that she'd be better off going and playing a few WTA 100Ks or ones, and getting some matches under her belt, winning 3 or 4 matches in one-sided ways, or actually would that be just not worth it?
There's an argument to it. I don't know if or not I would do it, because it's one of those. She might go and win some matches at that level, but we're still gonna have to. She's still gonna have to come back to WTA and win matches there on main tour. And I'm not certain that it's lack of matches that's the problem. The not having good draws thing is an absolute nonsense. If you're not seeded, you have to play a seed in the first or second round of any tournament. So, that's what you can expect. And there's so many, there's so many good female players out there at the minute, as we've said, in terms of players who can play well. There's a lot of them. There's not a whole lot of consistency, but there's a lot of players who can play well. So there's a lot of good players around. I'd be more worried about where a game's at than results, if I'm honest.
In what sense?
I didn't think she looked very good last week in that match against Ostapenko. And, you can say, Ostapenko played great, but, it's what we're talking about here. I don't like this mentality of just, there's certain people on social media who just I'd seen one last week going, we must remember that Emma Raducanu has only played 30 tournaments and she's still a novice at this level, right? 30 tournaments is not novice level. That's absolutely not. Also, she's won a Grand Slam. I think that's a disservice to Emma, to be honest, to be saying she's still a novice at this level and that kind of thing. And I don't think that she's as good a player as she was when she won the US Open. I think she's a worse player, not loads worse. But right now, what I saw last week and what I've seen little bits in the matches I've watched of her this year, I think she's a worse player. I think if the Emma Raducanu who won the US Open played the Emma Raducanu now, she'd comfortably beat her. And I don't just mean that. I don't just mean that one tournament. I mean anywhere from all of that summer, really.
And I think, sorry, George, to cut across you, but I think one of the things that's important to remember, and not to sort of defend her, but she's gone through, and having seen a lot of her up close one way or another in the last year and a half, I think she's gone through a pretty significant physical transformation. Like, she is definitely a different shape of athlete now than she used to be, and obviously has been through a lot of injuries as well. And I think that probably does have an impact on your game, inevitably. If your body changes, the way you play tennis changes. I thought I saw glimpses of that US Open winning Raducanu, specifically against Haddad Maia in Indian Wells. I thought just her attitude and the way she struck the ball in that match were close. But yeah, I know what you mean, Calvin. Yeah, I think probably if she did play that US Open final against the 2021 Raducanu now, I'm not convinced she'd win either. George, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
It's all right. I was going to ask a question. I mean, the other risk, of course, of dropping down to the level below is that you don't go and clean up these tournaments. And, that's a vaguely serious point, particularly in the women's game, that there is actually quite a large depth of play. I mean, the men's too, don't get me wrong, but there is a quite large depth of inconsistency that you do find quite a lot of good players kicking around at these events. And it's no guarantee. And, the broader challenge, people always say, oh, drop down a level, you'll get the confidence from winning. But if you drop down a level and you're not winning, the confidence ain't going to be popping up anytime soon. Like, she surely picked up some confidence from that run in Indian Wells. That was a couple of really, okay, not really good in inverted commas by what some people might view her potential as, which Calvin will always disagree with. But, Lynette and Haddad Maia are good tour players who are seeded. That's two good results. So she doesn't need to drop down to believe she can win matches at this level. She just needs to stay fit, get into a lot of these tournaments and hope these results come. But I'm not so sure there's much merit for her, particularly not for a bank balance dropping down anyway.
I think that, I read somewhere earlier on today that if she doesn't make the third round, she drops out of the top 100.
Yeah.
This week.
Well, she's not going to do it.
Also,
let's be honest.
No. And also, if Jodie Burridge qualifies and wins a round, she'd be British number 1.
Which she's British number 4 about 6 weeks ago.
Yeah,
it's quite the turnaround.
Might get picked for Billie Jean King Cup.
But if Burridge doesn't qualify, presumably that means no British women in the top 100, which will be pretty stark moment.
When was the last time? I wonder. Yeah.
I will say this about Emma, that I'm not sure that more I think about it, I don't think I'd be dropping down, but she might have no option but to drop down. If she drops out of the top 100, she'll have no option but to drop down.
Well, no, because I think...
yeah, she'll get wildcards and that kind of thing. But I kind of think, her level is... I think half the problem is that a lot of people are thinking, she's just got to find her way again. And, her level's a lot higher than this. But I'm not sure it is. It's like, I'm not sure what her potential is from this. And that's not me saying I don't think she's going to get back to the top. But I've watched her for the last 6 months or a year, I guess, and thought I'm not certain that this is like when I see a player who I think that's a top 20 player. I'm not sure I see that at the minute in Emma Raducanu, or in the future, or that's the player with the potential. The game just looks. The game just looks so boring. Like what? I don't know what type of player is she. She's not big enough to be a ball striker. She's not a huge ball striker like Sabalenka and Rybakina. She's not really. I don't think she sees herself as a counter puncher. Like, don't know who's gone blank here on the women's game. Who would be like the big counter puncher? She's not as fast around the court as Coco Gauff and that type of thing. She doesn't have a serve. She doesn't have good serve as Coco Gauff. She's not a sort of hands field player like Ons Jabeur. It's like it's just a bit.
I think you said
standard.
You said the other day she's a solid baseliner, and I think that's probably
solid baseliner. But what does solid baseliner get? How many solid baseliners are there in the top 20 at the minute?
Yeah, it's probably reasonable.
For what it's worth, I think there is a world where she could potentially reach the second round and hang on to the top 100. I think she might have to beat
Swiatek though. Depending on how other things...
It could be 99 or 100, I think, if she's...
Right.
And she might stay there with one win.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
But it is, there is some sort of semantic around, people will lose their heads if there's no British woman in the top 100 in the rankings. But if she does cling on to 99, there might be a saving grace for a huge inquiry. So
I wonder there. I was just going to say that, like, if, my initial thought was if she thought about dropping down and playing some lower ranked tournaments, that her numerous sponsors would go, no chance. We want you in like the main tour, and that kind of thing. But I wonder whether they care. It's one match, isn't it, at the minute?
Well, yeah, and I also don't know how much, like, I don't even know if you're like an account manager or a sponsorship head at one of these companies. I don't know whether that's a conversation you ever have. I've not worked in those circles.
I mean, you'd imagine there's clauses in there about her being a top 100 player, though, wouldn't you? I mean, there's got to be some sort of level where these people are like, there's got to be a certain standard you get into as part of contractually.
I think if you're an agent, you'd be doing, and like, let's face it, Max Eisenbud did these contracts. Like, I don't think.
But would he have predicted her dropping out the top 100 this quickly? I mean, it is a pretty big fall, isn't it?
I mean, Max has been around a long time, and he's a very shrewd operator. Like, I don't think there's a fart in hell's chance that when he signs those deals, there is he's like, this is locked in. There's no get out.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if you think about it in football, I mean, they all talk about a lot of sponsorship deals get done if the really biggest clubs aren't in the Champions League. It's not like an uncommon thing. I think there probably is some performance-related things in there that even someone as masterful as Eisenberg couldn't get rid of.
I think I think in this sort of circumstance, if he went in there with, I don't know who she got to deal with, Gucci, and they went, right, we want a deal. We want it written in there that she doesn't drop out of the top 100 or she's not getting paid. And he went, right, we're not signing the deal. Are they willing to risk that at that moment?
Yeah. Okay. He's in a very strong bargaining position. I'd be interested.
I'm also sure Gucci aren't really bothered about her tennis performance particularly. Perfectly honest. That's not the best sponsor.
Isn't that true of all the sponsors, though? Like, realistically?
Well,
they want exposure,
Nike,
don't
I suppose.
They want exposure.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm misinterpreting Gucci. I mean, for me as a sports fan, I don't watch Gucci and think, oh yeah, I want to wear some of that. But I suppose I'm not the target audience.
As a sport, I don't watch Gucci.
I don't want to buy Gucci when I'm watching sport.
Don't know, George. We might see if Oscar Otter turns out in a Gucci contract, then we'll be able to find out if you are a Gucci.
Once I've seen Otter Murray, the Murrays, and Andy Robertson from Liverpool wearing it, I'll maybe consider it.
Right, let's move on because this is into nonsense realms of sleep-deprived Belshaw. Let's talk ATP for a bit, shall we? The men's sort of runners and riders for Roland Garros is swiftly being whittled down. No one's pulled out yet, but I'm starting to get very worried about spending 3 weeks in France writing relentlessly about players that no one in Britain's ever heard of. But fingers crossed. Rafa Nadal has pulled out of Madrid. His psoas injury, which is a hip flexor muscle, is keeping him on the sidelines for another couple of weeks. I spoke to a hip expert this week, and you can read it in the Eye, who told me that this particular muscle, it does happen that you get an underlying issue that is hard to diagnose and it stops you recovering properly, suggesting things like torn labrum and all sorts of other things that would require surgery that could be behind it. Novak Djokovic pulled out as well with this elbow complaint that he's had the last couple of weeks. Yannick Sinner, who withdrew from the semi-final in Barcelona with illness, he is also out of Madrid. Matteo Berrettini, the cursed player. Nick Kyrgios, the man we all thought was going to take over on clay this year. Jack Draper too, an oblique injury that's continuing. Jensen Brooksby has had surgery. He's out pretty much for the rest of the clay season. Look, this is a long list, obviously, but why are there so many Masters clay tournaments jammed together?
First of all, just slightly off topic there. I saw earlier on my social media feed that Nick Kyrgios is confirmed for Laver Cup, and I thought, is there a more pointless confirmation than that one? He'd have no problem pulling out at a day's notice.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And also, but on that, I mean, I saw that list earlier on, James, and I don't know why Kyrgios is listed on there as withdrawn because he had no chance of playing from weeks ago, did it? He's in a boot.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have pulled out, I guess.
Yeah. In terms of the schedule around this time of year is just a mess for the reasons I said earlier, but also for the players who are not at the very, very top of the game. They're basically screwed for a few weeks because they can't play anything else if they don't get into Madrid, or if they lose in Madrid first round, they can't play a tour event for 2 weeks. And on top of that, you've then got an instance of there's 2 Masters 1000s in 2 weeks and 3 in 4 weeks. Is that right? Or 3 in 5 weeks?
Yeah, 3. I guess it is 3 and 5, and also within a concentration of a couple of 100 miles, or maybe 1,000 miles, but not far.
And Madrid is a completely different environment to the other 2. And the French Open come in not long after. So yeah, it's all a bit shoved in, but again, it won't change because none of those tournaments, they're all very well attended tournaments. None of them will give them up. The one I guess I said a few weeks ago, the one I don't get why they wouldn't change is Monte Carlo, because it's just the weather's crap there every year.
Yeah.
And you'd think they'd just want a better.
And it's it's a tiny draw. It's the smallest possible Masters, right, George? 54, is it? It hardly seems fair. Never mind a bit of a rubbish tournament as well. But equally, it's Monte Carlo, and it probably has kind of, a bit of emotional and political weight.
They can't really put it anywhere else, though, because only you can knock it a week later or 2 weeks later, and then you'd have 3 in 3 weeks.
Yeah. Which you couldn't do. It doesn't make sense to have this many European clay court Masters events, given the length of the clay court season. I mean, again, I don't want to set Belcher off on his "this is my global schedule" rethink.
About ditching Miami, which is never going to happen.
Indian Wells, which is also never going to happen.
Miami can stay, just about.
Indian Wells never going to happen. It's second, 5th biggest tournament on the year.
Yeah.
But
the
Masters is an interesting one because we should, as we've said before, we should have one in South America, but I don't know when you could fit one in.
You do it when Rio is. You do it when the Rio 500 is 100%.
You'd bin off Miami and Indian Wells, extend the clay court season, have a clay court Masters there, and then pull it all together.
Again, joking aside, the players don't want to do that. The players love going into Indian Wells and they love going to Miami.
Yeah,
it's not all about the players, Calvin.
So they're not going to.
And famously, the players don't have any power anyway, according to them.
No, but then you don't want to get bin off Miami. Miami's the one where no one goes. Indian Wells is full every day.
Yeah,
but Indian Wells has a climate that's a nightmare to move it anywhere else, and that little swing is pointlessly.
I mean, a climate to move it anywhere else. It's in the middle of the desert. It's the same climate all the time.
No, but it gets unplayable in certain parts.
Yeah, it gets too hot, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. I don't see what. Like I say, it's kind of a moot point to discuss because none of those tournaments will change, and we'll just keep having this instance every year where the players pull out. And the players, they have tried to encourage them to play by giving that 0 points rule that we spoke. Did we speak about that the other week?
Yeah, with Tsitsipas playing through his shoulder injury, but also signing in for doubles.
Yeah, but again, as we raised on our WhatsApp group, he's been moaning about his shoulder all year, but plays doubles every week.
I don't really understand that.
But he's playing more doubles this year than he's ever played before. He's not even he used to just play with his brother to help his brother out, but now he's playing with anyone.
Very strange. Speaking of Stefanos Tsitsipas, he is going to open a school. Now, people will remember in Australia, he said if he wins the Australian Open, he's going to open a school in Australia because he saw on a number plate that Victoria is the state of education, and that's how suggestible Stefanos Tsitsipas is. He said after he was beaten by Carlos Alcaraz, I'm going to just keep working on the backhand. I just want to hit winners, do the same thing the double-handed backhanders do. I don't want to set a limit to myself. I don't want to make this... Well, by no means is a single-handed backhand worse than a double-handed backhand. Maybe one day I can open an academy for single-handed backhand. Things that are really unlikely,
if you wanted to send your kid to an academy and how to hit single-handed backhand, why would you send Stefanos Tsitsipas is back academy for doing that.
Knowing him,
it's absolute rubbish.
Knowing him, there'd also be a ban on hitting any other shot. It'd just be the one-handed backhand academy, where people just hit one-handed backhands all day.
I think he, for context and for people who've maybe missed this, he got to the final in Barcelona and was... I mean, I've watched quite a lot of Carlos Alcaraz for a number of years, and he's obviously played a lot of great matches. I think I said it in the WhatsApp group. He looks shit hot. I don't care if he's just come off an injury layoff or what, but it's ridiculous. There was one moment when Tsitsipas started trading backhand to backhand and was sort of getting a bit of superiority, managed to run around it and hit a forehand into the Alcaraz backhand and came in behind it, and Alcaraz lobbed him about 6 feet inside the baseline. Like, it was just... And it wasn't a bad approach. He wasn't in a perfect position, but it wasn't bad. And it was just like, crikey, if this guy starts hitting his backhand, how is anyone ever going to beat it?
Yeah, I mean, I do sometimes watch Alcaraz and think, you're going to have by far the highest level anyone's ever seen.
Yeah.
Like, considering like his age and stuff. And obviously, there's a bit of kind of a recency bias, I'm sure, there. The Big Four were all pretty good when they were young, but he does just have so many attributes of kind of like a perfect blend of those guys that he is. Yeah, he's phenomenally talented, and that drop shot that we talked about earlier, that's such a weapon to his armory on top of like essentially a carbon copy of Federer's forehand when he, which was one of the best forehands ever as well. It's very exciting for tennis to have someone this good so quickly after those guys. You just need the narrative of him toppling Djokovic, really. That's the one kind of narrative that needs to happen quite soon. And then hopefully the people to come along and give him good matches, which only Yannick Sinner seems to be doing at the minute. But yeah, he's I won't dwell on percentages this week, but he's moved to my favourite for the French Open given the kind of the broader men's context this week. And I said last week, Tsitsipas can be quite useful on the clay, and Tsitsipas will quite fancy his chances of another French Open final this year, I suspect. If he gets the right draw, considering the big players who are kind of out of the way, I do still think he can beat the majority of most fields on clay, and I think he's had a good week. If you look at the players he's beaten, it wasn't a bad set of wins. But if he plays Alcaraz, and if he plays a fit Djokovic, and if he plays a fit Nadal, he ain't going to win the tournament. So, he needs those four to go. But, a few of them might have gone by default. So who knows?
Just those names that Tsitsipas beat this week: Pedro Cashin, Denis Shapovalov, Alex de Minaur, Lorenzo Musetti, and only dropped one set on his way. I would just be concerned. I know Alcaraz is shit hot at the moment, like I said, but Tsitsipas had nothing. I mean, I think he hit 8 winners. Like, he just there was no way past the guy. To be fair, Alcaraz's stats were 26 winners and 7 unforced errors, I think it was, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of spoke about how Raducanu's game's not developed. I think that's the big criticism of Tsitsipas, really, is that there's not... In the biggest matches, there's not much development in his game, and if anything, he just looks more vulnerable now. More and more top players have played him, and that's not to say he's not a brilliant player. This guy's been consistently top 5 for a long time. That's not an easy thing to do. But I'm very unconfident of him beating any of the biggest players in the world in the biggest matches of the world. And that's a problem if you're someone wanting to become what he wants to become. And I feel that wasn't the case 3 years ago. It felt like he could still have that kind of surprise factor that could give him, big match wins over Federer, over Nadal, even though, not at their best tournaments or whatever, best times in the career. Now, I wouldn't give him a sniff, really, if he faced Alcaraz or Djokovic, if they're fit at the French Open. Just wouldn't even consider that being a close match unless Djokovic is rolling around pretending there's something wrong and just to wind him up and he'll still win anyway. Just drag it out for an extra 2 sets.
Calvin, broadly agree?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I said last week that I had Alcaraz favourite. So nothing's changed there. I'm not as weak-minded as George and waiting to see who wins the last tournament and then basing things on that. George now thinks Alcaraz is going to win the French Open because he's beaten Stefanos Tsitsipas and a couple of other
Well, this could be a natural segue to the real reason I've now moved to Alcaraz, and that's more actually where Novak Djokovic has gone in the last week. That's probably the bigger swing for me. So I'll let you go from there, James. After I've gloriously introduced you.
See, something I found weird. I don't want to put a dampener on it, but I saw last week somebody said that, or the week before when he pulled out of, did he pull out Miami or pull out Monte Carlo? That Alcaraz has got a minor arthritis in his wrist. But that doesn't sound great, does it? At 19.
This is, it's called post-traumatic arthritis in his left hand. I don't know what that means. I know that Eleanor Surdi is something of a bone expert and is a regular listener, so maybe she can give us a little bit of expertise on that. But
what I find interesting about Alcaraz when he has these injuries, he's the complete opposite of Rafa Nadal was. Like Alcaraz will release a press statement. It's got the MRI scan in it.
It's
ultrasound,
ridiculously detailed.
Full thesis from the doctor who did it. Whereas if Nadal pulled out of that, it'd be upper body injury, and that'd be it. That's all we get. Hand injury.
Yeah, it's quite a different level of detail. George was trying to create a seamless segue, but as you know, George, if you signpost them, it's never quite as good. Novak Djokovic is under an injury cloud. There's no other word for it, really. He dropped a set to Luka Van Asch in Banja Luka, but did win that match, wearing quite a significant strapping on his right elbow. He came out against Dusan Lajovic without the strapping. I thought maybe that would be fine, but he was pretty poor against Dusan Lajovic, who beat him 6-4, 7-6, and went on to win only his second career title on... not home soil, because Banja Luka is in Bosnia, but there are a lot of Serbs in the crowd, needless to say. So I'm happy for him. He's someone that we've always talked about as one of the few clay court specialists still kicking around. George, what was that stat about? He's won his last matches against all sorts of different top 20 players.
Yeah, I can dig it out. Here we go. So I haven't fact checked all this, so excuse me if it's wrong, but I checked a few of them.
Well, who are we blaming? Who do you nicked it off?
So yeah, we'll obviously shout out. It's Vanch on Twitter. Vanch 2K. I don't really know
of a recent fight with Craig Gabriel.
Right, yes. The very same. He's getting featured on this podcast quite a lot recently.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was an excellent tweet. Dusan Lajovic won his last match against Djokovic. Medvedev, team, maybe not so good these days, but still. Murray, Del Potro, Rude, Rublev. And then he finishes it with an elite pro clap.
Thanks for the full quotation there, George. It's really, really essential at the end. Credit to him, and one for the single-handers. Maybe Dusan Lajovic will open a single-handed backhand academy, which I think might be in a bit more demand from Calvin Betton's students than Stefanos Tsitsipas' single-handed backhand academy. I know it's hard to tell with Djokovic because you don't get much info out of him at the best of times, but Calvin, he wouldn't have pulled out of Madrid as a ruse.
No, it's true.
Begrudgingly.
Yeah. He's such a weirdo, though. You never know with him. No, he must be injured. Yeah. I'll swallow this one up. I still don't believe he had a 7-mile tear in his hamstring. He's claimed at the Aussie Open.
I mean, has anyone actually extracted what's wrong with him yet? Because this is presumably the same elbow he did have surgery on back in 2017, which obviously is, while it was a minor surgery, the fact it took him so long to actually agree to have a surgery on it, whatever the hell it was. I'm
sorry,
it's so weird.
George, this is presumably the same elbow. He's only got 2 of them. He doesn't play with one of the other ones in here.
Well, Calvin, when you hit a 2-handed backhand, you can use both elbows interchangeably, of course. No, I meant more, Has anyone got a diagnosis around like whether it is the elbow, whether it's kind of the forearm, or whether it's it's not 100% clear. I don't think. I've not really seen anything that's kind of said. And even if it was the same elbow, is it exactly the same issue? I suppose is what I was more driving at. I'm not sure how varied elbow issues get. I'm sure there is a bit.
Well, I mean, yeah, but it's all interconnected, isn't it? And once you've had surgery on a joint, it does tend to create other issues.
I still don't get this. Joker was saying about Alcaraz there, and goes into a lot of detail. I still don't really understand why players don't say what the injury is. I don't get who that benefits that they don't know. Like,
I suppose if I knew that George had pulled his hamstring 3 weeks ago, rather than like had a left shoulder issue, I might play a slightly different way to try.
Would you though? Would these players, or are they just going to try and beat them? Like, I don't think that's ever a way to play either. Like, you never go like, oh, now I'm. It's like when. I always remember when I was playing, and like my dad, bless him, like somebody would be like, they'd roll their ankle, and my dad would go, right, make him run. Like, what the chuffing hell do you think I've been doing for the last hour of the match? Just hitting the middle to him, like So it's. You're going to try and, you're going to play the same anyway. And against Djokovic, and it's well there. We know it's an elbow injury, so we know it's not a hamstring injury or something. And so what?
We assume it is. Like he had, like I said, he said the elbow was okay after the Lajovic
sleeve
match.
On as well, didn't he?
But he didn't wear that for he didn't wear that for the Lajovic match. He only wore it for the Van Asch match, and he kind of. I seem to remember seeing maybe Sasha was tweeting that he'd said that the elbow wasn't a problem, but as we know, like Djokovic doesn't like to talk about injuries after he loses because I think he thinks it kind of detracts from his opponent, which is quite a classy thing to do, to be honest.
Fair play on that. I mean, he just talks about them throughout the tournament and then doesn't mention them when he's lost. It all seems a bit shady to me that when players do that. I don't really get why they wouldn't just say. You don't have to go in full detail about it. Just go, I've done this. This is what I've got. I've got a ligament tear in my elbow or something.
Yeah. He is still down to play Rome as his last event before Roland Garros. I think, again, kind of guessing, but I would guess that might not happen because I think he'd probably. What do you think, George?
I think he will play Rome. I mean, obviously we'll see to what extent it is, but it's a tournament he likes and what he's done well in over the years. I think probably fancy himself to get a better result in Rome than Madrid these days, and also buys him an extra week in. I'd be quite surprised if he was really keen on turning up at the French Open with just the matches he's had under his belt.
Especially given
practice perspective, the gap. Yeah, exactly. So I think he'll try and play that, and I can't see him playing the week before the French.
Well, you don't think he'll head to Lyon or Geneva? No,
I'd be very surprised.
Play a little 250. Imagine. Yeah, it doesn't seem very likely, does it? We should mention because it's in the notes, and I forgot to mention it while we were talking about Alcaraz, that Dan Evans lost to him in the semi-final, which was a decent week because Evo's had an absolutely, I think he would probably admit as well, stinker of a year. I think there were maybe 6 or 7 matches in a row that he lost. It was, in fact, 6 before he finally picked up a couple of wins in Marrakesh. And he's 3 wins in a row, beat Arnaldi Hachinov, which is an excellent victory, and then Cherundolo in Barcelona. So that's decent news for a man who has improved over the years on the clay. George, are there any other stories you kind of wanted to alert? I mean, this Holger Rune Botic Van De Zandschulp match elicited much reaction on social media, as almost all Holger Rune matches do now.
Yeah. I mean, Botic will be pretty gutted. He didn't win that one, and I thought Rune sent him quite a nice little message afterwards, didn't he? Where he sort of said, that happened to me earlier this year. I don't,
So Van De Zandschulp had match points, right?
Yeah, championship points. Yeah, I think he was up quite far. I think in the third set as well. I can't remember if it was like 5-1 or something. I mean, Rune. I suppose the big point for me is, where's he sitting in the favourites at the minute. I've got a bit of a feeling Rune could be a surprise finalist at the French, and not that big a surprise given how well he's playing. But I think he's positioning himself quite well. I'd back him in a lot of quite big matches against big players who aren't Alcaraz and Djokovic at the minute, on clay specifically. I think he'd have a good chance against Medvedev. I think he'd have a good chance against Tsitsipas. Zverev isn't quite where he was. I'm not saying he would beat Alcaraz, but Djokovic, he's not quite there at the moment. So there are windows of opportunities in this tournament. He's in good form. He is going to win the French Open 14 times at some point.
Has to start somewhere.
Yeah, are the stars aligning? Is this the first year of the new Rafael Nadal era?
Well, it should be noted that in this final, Van de Zandschulp was up 5-2 in the third set. He had 4 match points. He served for the championship 3 times, and Rune turned it round. He also did pick up an ankle injury in the middle of the match, and had to take. Well, he said he had to take a medical timeout. There was some controversy about the exact timing of it. I mean, as people know, I think medical timeouts should be a bit more regulated, and you should only be allowed to take them at certain points and times. But you can't make people play injured, apparently. Seems perfectly unreasonable. But yeah, I'm kind of with you, George. Calvin, I know you have a bit of a bee in the bonnet about Holger Rune, but he's a tremendous shithouse, and I think that could go against this kind of. I don't want to sound too much like a Telegraph columnist here, but against this soft generation who can't cope with pressure and shithousery, I can imagine Holger Rune putting the they don't like it up 'em, sir.
Is this going out on GB News, this podcast? Mike Graham over there presenting it.
Nigel Farage is on the next episode.
Listen, I don't have any issue with Holger Rune's tennis. I think he's very much in the mix to go deep in the French. I don't deny that. I do deny a bit that I don't think he's not such a he's not a savvy funny shithouse like Medvedev is. He's just a bit of a bell end, and Medvedev's got a bit of Mourinho about him, hasn't he? That you've got to laugh at some of the stuff that he does. Holger Rune's never done anything funny, has he? He's just not funny.
I mean, I assume he's done something funny at some point.
I don't know if he has. Maybe
he had funny hair once.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
And to be fair, saying you're going to win 14 French Opens is
funny,
quite funny. In fairness,
but yeah, I didn't see the match for Van de Zandschulp, but he's in the mix for the French. Yeah, I'd have Alcaraz and Djokovic as in the top tier of. Still have Djokovic if you think he's going to be playing and in some sort of form, and then I'd still have Medvedev slightly above Rune and Sinner.
Okay.
Slightly above them.
Yeah, I think probably just on the basis of mental rather than game. But
and do you have Tsitsipas below them, or
Tsitsipas is not winning the French Open, George.
He's on 0%. I agree. He's on 0%.
But he has at least been to a final.
Yeah, I mean he's got worse since then. He's not as good as he was.
He was in a Grand Slam final just this year, Calvin. I don't know. He's the sort of player who could take advantage of the draw for me. The draw feels like it is dangerously close to going potentially badly at this French Open from the men's perspective.
I think no, he's just not winning it. I tell you what is weird though, how Zverev doesn't seem to be getting any better. I thought that we'd start seeing some.
Well, the Medvedev match felt like a chance.
No, it did.
For him to kind of win a good match,
but you think that now he looks physically fine now. There's no repercussions of that, and he's had plenty of matches now. You can't say he's not. It's match tightness that normally is an issue there. But
he lost to just to be specific, he lost to Christopher O'Connell in Munich, which is. I mean, I should say that Zverev never. I mean, I could be wrong. He's very rarely played well in front of his own fans, and he has talked about, specifically about playing in Germany. And I know that there's a bit of a strategy, and they want him to do it more from a sort of commercial perspective. But I think he has talked about before it being tough for him. And I'm not, it's one match, so who knows? But And also, like, I know you can say he should be match fit now, but like, it's such a big traumatic injury. You know, some people don't. Some people never come back from that kind of stuff, and it just must be such a mental block for a guy who we know is mentally pretty useless. And, you know, the second serve, the Grand Slam against top 10 players, bottling, also the fact that he's a knobhead. I think probably the head's gone a little bit, Calvin. I could be wrong, but that's my reading of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I find it strange, you know, like you said, he was on kind of the path where you'd think, yeah, you know, it's going to take a while to get back into any sort of form, and then he started looking a bit better. You know, he started looking okay. Now it makes sense, but then just doesn't seem to be. It doesn't seem to be pushing past that stage of like where would you have him at the minute? What would you say he is in the world, like in terms of actual power rankings of, you know, where he's at?
40 maybe. Like he beat Bautista Agut, he beat Bublik. You know, pushed Medvedev, but yeah, I mean maybe higher than that. Like he. But then, you know, that Taro Daniel one where he lost Love and 4 in Miami. It's like... Yeah. But, yeah, I don't know.
Madrid will give us the best tell because he's unplayable in Madrid.
Yeah. Yeah, that's his place, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for. And George looks like he might actually fall asleep at his microphone, which, while I admit, again, would be funny. It's not what we want to happen. As always, please do tell your friends about the podcast. Vote for us in any upcoming awards. There's local elections in the UK. Vote for us in them. Why not? I mean, might as well. Write in candidates. I'm sure Calvin will serve the people of Barnsley well. And do leave us a rating, review, wherever you get your podcasts. And most importantly, please do come back next week.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Sports Social Podcast Network.